Great. So I'm Mark Isaacson. You can find me as vegan triathlete on Drupal.org, and I'm not really in IRC much, but when I'm in IRC, you would see me as that. I'm a Drupal freelancer, and like I said, you can find me on Drupal.org as vegan triathlete. You can also find me on GitHub as vegan triathlete, and my company is isaacsonwebdevelopment.com. I've been doing this since 2010, and I'm still doing it because I love web development and I love open source and I love Drupal, particularly even more so now that Drupal 8's come out, because I think Drupal 8 is awesome, and I think that you will think so too. And what I do, how I do my Drupal is I'm a code monkey. I'm a back-end guy. That's what I love to do. But enough about me. How about you? This is targeted towards people who are beginner Drupal 8 developers. And by beginner, I mean that could mean that you haven't done anything at all with it. I don't make any assumptions that you know any stuff about Drupal or Drupal 8. So I'll go over things at a level so that you should be able to get some grasp of it. And what I'm expecting you want to be getting out of this is that you're going to get a handle at a high level. Obviously, in whatever that I have now, the 40 minutes or 35 minutes or whatever it ends up being, I'm not going to be able to make you expert PHP, object-oriented programmers, Drupal 8 master Jedis, but you should be able to get something at a high level. And I'm telling you that you want to do it as soon as possible, because learning Drupal 8 gives you many benefits beyond just knowing Drupal 8 itself. You're learning web development best practices. So even if you've had it up to with Drupal, it's still worthwhile to leverage the Drupal knowledge that you have to learn Drupal 8, because you're going to pick up skills in learning Drupal 8 that are going to make you more marketable even outside of the Drupal community. So get on it, start learning this stuff. And you can start doing that right here in this presentation, because we're going to be looking at code examples. Yes, that's right. There will be code. You've been forewarned. And as I mentioned, the reason that I am encouraging you to learn about Drupal 8 is that besides it's awesome, it makes you more marketable outside of Drupal 8. How you're going to do it is, did I mention there was going to be code in this presentation? Yes, you're going to see some sample code in this presentation. So what are we doing in this presentation? It's a brief introduction to the basic and often used patterns that you will see in Drupal. It's not all the edge cases, it's not getting into all the nooks and crannies, it's not telling you every single thing you need to do to build any site you would possibly want to build in Drupal, but we are going to look at the patterns that you will tend to use over and over again. So what is it not? It's not this comprehensive unearthing of every single thing that you could want to know. It's not getting into every edge case. It's not going to tell you exactly what you're going to need to do in every single situation. So just kind of understand that going into it, like what the intention is here of what you're supposed to get out of it, and I think you'll find that it is quite suitable for you. So here's your chance to bail. After having said that, these guidelines that I'm putting up there, if you think all of this is fair and you're willing to play along, stay. If you're not, then feel free to leave, and I won't at least try to let on to be too upset or hurt by it. But I haven't lost any of you so far, so let's just roll on. What am I going to talk about? When I call this OOP design patterns and Drupal 8, the things that I'm going to talk about when I look at OOP are things like interfaces, classes and abstract classes, traits, dependency injection, and services. What I'm not going to talk about is like, this is what all of the real web developers do when they do PHP, and if you do it any differently, you aren't entitled to, classify yourself as a web developer. I'm not going to get into any of the flame wars about, this versus that type of a thing. This is giving you a chance to get a sense of like some OOP concepts. Some of the things that I say, maybe some people would argue with me, but what I'm telling you about is really the way things are being done in Drupal. So whether the PHP world loves all of this or not, it is the way that it's been adopted in Drupal. When I talk about design patterns, I'm talking about Drupal types of design patterns, like the YAML files and using services and plugins and using the service container. I'm not talking about, like, if you're familiar with the Gang of Four, and where they're talking about things like, oh, this is a decorator, or this is an adapter, or this is a factory. While Drupal does use some of those types of design patterns, in the way that they program things. I'm talking about Drupal's type of design patterns that you're going to see over and over again. And when I'm talking to you about Drupal 8, I'm talking about looking at some specific code examples here that are going to get you up and running. What I'm not going to get into, this is geared towards developers. This isn't geared towards site builders. So we're not looking at things like users, roles, and permissions. We're not looking at things like, oh, this is how you do views, or this is how you will do multilingual. So that gives you a sense of like how this is being targeted with regards to what's OOP, what's design patterns, and what are we looking at in Drupal 8. Great. So one of the main pieces that we're going to use to be looking at those things is the module that's running this presentation. So yes, I've written a module that I'm using so that I can give this presentation to you in Drupal 8. This is a Drupal 8 instance that's running on my machine, and I'm using this little module that I've written, and you can find it at github.com/vegan/athlete/presentation. And by the way, you can actually find this entire presentation there if you wanted to download it and run it on your own computer. So you don't have to go crazy taking notes here. If you can set up your local web development environment here, go ahead, go to GitHub, get it. It's called OOP-DP-D8, I think. It's in the same profile there. So you could actually run this presentation on your own computer later on if you wanted to. All right, so taking a high-level look at some of the things that we're going to be able to touch on and the things that I actually did use within this module that I wrote. Every module and every theme has to have an info YAML file. That's just the way that it works. In Drupal, that's the way that you make yourself known to Drupal. I've got a services file, a services YAML file that I created because I wrote a service for this module that's running. We've got a routing file because there's a controller that we are going to see in use very soon. And there's the libraries file because I actually did have to create a small little bit of JavaScript, and so I put it inside a library, and so I can say when I want to attach that library. And I've got my .module file. Yes, actually there are still some things that are not in object-oriented in Drupal 8, and we put those into a .module file. And in fact, I needed one for this particular module that I've written here. So all those things that I mentioned end up being in the root of your modules folder. So we see we've got our info file, our libraries, our module file, our routing, our services file, and then I've also put a README in there. There are a few other things that can appear in your root directory as well, but most of the stuff that you're going to be doing when you are writing in Drupal 8 is going to go under your source directory, and that's the way that it works out in my situation as well. So again, there's an actual module that I wrote that we're looking at here. You can look at the module later on, pull it out of the repository, and you'll see exactly where everything sits and how I've named all of the stuff and how all of the pieces come together. It's pretty awesome and pretty meta the way that I did this presentation, and I'm doing the presentation on the module that I called presentation to run my presentation. Can you dig it? All right, so I've mentioned services now, and this might be a new concept to you. Like, what is a service? So we are using services, and where we are getting a chance to see services in action right here in this module, you actually saw it in each of these slides, where I've got this previous link, this next link. I've got a block that's going to put those links there, but the block is tapping into a service, and the service returns, oh, here's the previous link, here's the next link. All the block does is generate a clickable link based on what it gets back from the service. You see these slide images that I've put here, these little thumbnails that I'm popping up. There's a service that it returns the images that are associated with the node that's being displayed. When you came in and you sat down and you got to see that, oh, ever so excruciating period of time where we were trying to get this silly thing to work, and you got to stare at the table of contents for a long time, that is built off a service as well. This happens to be a controller that's displaying a page, but the controller is just utilizing the service to get the table of contents. And as a matter of fact, I've got a block that also utilizes that same service. If we wanted to, I could have placed a block in the presentation, and we could have had a block that shows the table of contents. So we've got the controller and the block that are leveraging this same service to create a table of contents. So let's start having a look at this. what is this service that I'm talking about? The service is my presentation manager service. I put it into a class, and it's implementing an interface. We'll get a look at an interface in a little bit. But this is the service that is providing this functionality that I'm talking about, the presentation manager service. There's my create table of contents method. This is what I was referring to when I said that it's going to access the service. The controller and the block both reference this create table of contents method, and this is where that logic is so that the controller and the block can display the table of contents. What we like to do is keep things as thin and lightweight as possible, and also as reusable as possible in Drupal 8. So it's really easy. You'll see when you look at the code how it makes use of that method. I've also got methods for the previous slide and for getting the next slide. And finally, I've got the method for getting the slide images. So those are I think it ends up being 5 methods that I put into that service. And so you've seen pretty much the entire contents of the service that I've written for this particular module. A service is just something that provides useful functionality to an application. It's bundling up some things, and then it's now accessible in different places within the application, as opposed to being tied inside one specific place, and then it's not very easy to get to. So what you want to look at when you are writing your modules, I still stumble over what to call them, because we used to call them modules because you always had a dot module, and sometimes we might have a dot module, and sometimes we don't even need a dot module anymore. So I don't really love calling them modules, but the community hasn't really adopted a name. I'd like to think of it in terms of calling it like our library or our component is what I would call it, because what you can also think about when you're writing things here is not that this particular library or component that I've written would be particularly useful outside of Drupal, but it is theoretically possible that you would be writing something that you would be able to use within Drupal, but that might then also be useful outside of an actual Drupal website. So think in terms of the libraries that you're creating. But those are the methods that I've had in this module or library or component, whatever you want to call it. So now, I said we're going to have a look at interfaces. So wherefore art thou interface? Now, I know wherefore actually means why, but wherefore art thou just sounds really cool. So it's not why. We're looking at what an interface is, and I know wherefore actually means why. But just go with me on this one there, because it's kind of artistic, and it gives us a more intellectual air to it. So wherefore art thou interface? An interface is basically a blueprint or a contract. It specifies what any class that implements that interface must define. You have to have these methods in your class that you actually implement them. You have a physical like logic that's in there. Interfaces are also the things that really make dependency injection work. Now that's actually a lie. Dependency injection will work without interfaces, but it won't work as well, because what you do with dependency injection is you're expecting some objects to be injected into. Typically it's injected through your constructor, and then you type hint what you're expecting to get in there. And so what you do is you type hint with an interface instead of type hinting with a class. And what really works well by doing that is that now any class that implements that interface can be injected. It can be used in whatever it is that you're writing. Whereas if you type hint with a specific class, that's the only thing that PHP will accept. And this doesn't make things very pluggable or very interchangeable, because if it's expecting that specific class and you want to change the functionality, that means you have to hack that class and change the code in the class. If you type hint with an interface, any class that implements that interface can be injected. And so now you've got your own class. You can do whatever you want to do with it. And if you didn't like the way that that particular class that was used in the application was doing things, and you wanted to do your own thing, you could implement that interface, and then it's totally fine that your class is getting injected into wherever it's getting injected. And it's totally transparent. Nothing has to change. The code, it all works beautifully. So this is why we use interfaces. So how we define interfaces is that instead of using the class keyword, we use the interface keyword. And then for purposes of making things really obvious, the way I've written my module is I've named my classes like Presentation Manager Service, Presentation Manager Service Interface. The way that Drupal does things, you actually are supposed to name your interfaces with the word interface in the end. You don't really have to name your services with the name service at the end there. So I've gone a little over the top, but you can name things the way that you want anyway, and this is logical enough. But so with the Presentation Manager Service itself, we use the class keyword. With the interface, we use the interface keyword. And that's how you go about letting PHP know that this is an interface. So now we're going to get a chance to see, well, what does an interface look like actually? An interface is, like I said, it's a blueprint or a contract, but pretty much all it does is it defines their methods that you're putting in a class, even though what we define the methods is we call them functions. So you can call it a function, you can call it a method, it's the same thing. When you've got a class has properties and a class has methods. And what a method is just the function. The interface defines what methods a class must implement. So you'll notice that there's no code here at all. There's not even curly braces there. What the interfaces do is they serve as a great form of documentation, actually. This is something that a non-technical person could look at and get an understanding of like, oh, what is this service supposed to do? Well, just look at the interface. Look at most of what you have in the interface are comments. There's what we consider lines of code is like just that one thing that defines what that signature looks like for that method. The rest of it is just your doc block. So it's very useful documentation, besides being a way that you enforce what classes need to do that are going to implement that interface. So here's where I describe what my table of contents does. Here's where I describe what the get previous slide is supposed to do. And then here's where I have specified, here's what the get next slide and get slide images need to do. Now you'll notice what I'm needing to do when I'm showing this to you right now is I need to keep escaping out of this and then clicking the next image. What would be a nice enhancement to this module would be to say, oh, it would be actually nice if we had a get previous image and a get next image method as well, so that I could be inside the image, and instead of escaping and clicking something else, you could kind of do it like you were doing with a color box gallery. So if I at any point actually end up adding that, I would come back into this interface and I would put those methods in there, because I would say, haha, if you think you guys can write the code better than I can, that's great, but if you're writing your own presentation manager service, now you also need to code the methods for the get previous image and the get next image. So that'll be a way that I might actually modify this module when I have the free time, which is going to be sometime approximately never. But just theoretically, if I were going to do that. So now we've gotten a chance to see a class, we've gotten a chance to see interfaces. We've seen a class that implemented an interface. In PHP, the way that we do our objects, we define our objects, is inside of classes. And what you need to know is that PHP is a single inheritance language. So you inherit by extending a class, but you're only allowed to extend one class. In other languages, you can actually extend more than, I don't know that they use the keyword extend, but it's the same concept. You can extend more than one class, and you can inherit all of the properties and all the methods from all of those different classes. In PHP, you can't do that. You can only extend one class. You can have the whole ancestry, the whole tree, so you extended a class, and that class had extended another class, and that class extended another class. So you can inherit a whole lot of stuff, but it's coming down this, like this vertical type of inheritance, as opposed to like merging various things in. So that's one thing to know about classes. That's how you define your objects. You instantiate a class into an object, but you can only inherit from one other class. For instance, we have, I mentioned I wrote a controller. I've got more than one controller that I've written, but one of the controllers I've written is the controller that is responsible for creating the content that goes inside of these modals that pop up. So I've got this controller that's called display slide image, which is what you're looking at right now. You're looking at a slide image that's inside of a modal. That controller extends the controller base naturally. The controller base provides a certain amount of functionality. My block extends the block base. Okay, I can't have something extend both the controller base and the block base. So this is the concept of single inheritance. And in this case, I'm extending the controller base because I'm writing a controller. And the controller base is more useful to me when I need to do that type of a thing. I told you I was going to talk about abstract classes as well. So we've looked at a class. We've looked at an interface. We haven't talked about abstract classes. And that's what we're going to do now. We're going to have a look at abstract classes. So what you need to know about abstract classes is that you can't actually instantiate an abstract class. So that's where a class is sort of like an interface, because you must implement an interface. The interface doesn't provide any code. An abstract class cannot be instantiated directly. You actually need to have a concrete class that extends that abstract class, and then you instantiate from the concrete class. Okay? So abstract classes are sort of like interfaces, but they're also sort of like classes because you can put logic inside of your abstract classes. But you still can't extend more than one class. Even when you're dealing with an abstract class, you can only extend the one. That does not get you around single inheritance. And actually, I had one more thing I needed to say here is that I didn't actually have to write an abstract class for my module, and I didn't want to throw one in there and make it some weird thing just for the purpose of having an abstract class. So we're not going to be able to look at the presentation module that I wrote. We're going to look at some Drupal core so that you can get a chance to see, so like what's the deal with an abstract class? It's sort of like an interface. It's sort of like a class. Why do we even want to have an abstract class? Let's have a look at the examples here. What we are going to look at is this list item base abstract class, which also happens to extend the field item base, and it also implements an interface. It's not important whether this field item base is a concrete class or an abstract class. It makes no difference whatsoever. And you don't really need to worry anymore about the field item base or the interface that it implements. Just remember that we're going to be looking at this list item base abstract class. And when we look at an abstract class, we can inherit properties. We're going to be looking at the methods, though. And there's different types of methods that you're going to end up putting into an abstract class. So this first method that we're looking at, actually these first couple of methods that we're looking at here, you can see this is how it's different from an interface, because these methods have not just a signature, but they have logic inside of it. And these methods can be inherited and can be used straight up inside the class that extends it. And that's what's going to happen with these. These don't get overridden. They don't get overloaded. They don't get extended. They're just used straight up. So that's one type of a method that you would see in an abstract class, is a fully laid out method that's intended to be used in other classes. Another type of method that you would see is this abstract method. This is why we need an abstract class. This is the whole reason that we need to have this concept of an abstract class. An abstract method, for instance, is saying the allowed values description, and if you think of the list item base that we're defining here, there's really no way that this class could know what the descriptions are going to be for your abstract, for your allowed values. So it's not even bothering to define any logic in here, but it's saying when you extend me, you must define this method inside of your class. And so what we've done is this is where it's sort of like an interface. The abstract class has no idea how it's going to do this for the specific classes, but it wants to make sure the specific classes do it. So you define an abstract method, and that's where now those classes are going to actually have to define this in there. So that's the second type of method. The first one was write a method that you actually inherit and you use straight up. The second type we just looked at is like defining an interface. This is abstract. You got to put it in there. I don't know what you're going to do. You got to figure that out. And then the third type of method that we would see in an abstract class is where we would have something like when you notice this that says cast allowed, and this is kind of a simple example, so it's not really typical of what you would do with the idea of overloading, because there's only the one line that we have here where we're returning a value, but it still kind of gives you the chance to see the concept in a little bit here. And what you would do with when this type of a method is that you have the ability to use the scope resolution operator when you're doing things in your class, and you can actually run the parents method if you want to, and then you can do some stuff after that. And that's what this is getting at, showing you an example of, although it's not a perfect example. So let's look at doing those types of things. So we've got this list string item, which is a class that's extending our list item base, which was the abstract class. Those first two methods that I showed you, they don't even appear in the list string item class because it inherits them directly, and it makes no further modifications. It just uses them. They work totally fine for it. When we look at the next one that I pointed out, here's where's the concrete implementation of that abstract method. And here's where it actually defines what happens in the allowed values description. This is where we put the logic inside of it. And now it actually does something. And then the third thing that we looked at was the one where I was saying that you would overload it. And you can see what it's done here. Instead of just saying return value, here's where it's actually casting it as a string. And again, this isn't the greatest example because it's not having to use the scope resolution operator and then doing a little bit more. It's basically just totally overriding the parent method. If there were more that were happening in this particular method, you could see inside of this method, it would say like something equals parent, colon, method name, and then it would actually run the parent's method, and then it would do something following on that. Okay, so that's abstract classes. So now we've seen the three things that I'd mentioned early on that we would see: interfaces, classes, and abstract classes. And I've mentioned that PHP is single inheritance, and you can only extend one class, which presents a problem for you, because I told you I've got a block and I've got a controller that are displaying a table of contents. And you would say, isn't displaying that table of contents probably going to have really, really similar logic, especially considering the fact that they're using the same service? So how do we get to use that same method that you really need to have in there? That's why we have traits. So traits are one of the things that have kind of a little bit of controversy around them in the PHP community. But I think that there's general acceptance that they can be used properly. And the main intention of traits is that it's a way to help you get around this single inheritance of PHP. You can put a method inside a trait, and now that trait can be used in different classes, so you don't have to repeat yourself. And you've got one place where you're able to change that method if there's a bug in it. That's what traits are about. So let's look at an example of using a trait. And I did actually have a need for a trait in my presentation module. As small as it is, I needed one. So I defined it. The trait that I defined is this table of contents trait. And the way that you specify that you're going to be defining a trait is you use the trait keyword. So we've seen interface, we've seen class, we've seen abstract class, and now we are seeing trait as the keyword for the different types of classes that we're defining. So I created this table of contents trait. And what I put in that table of contents trait is a method called build. Now I chose to name it build because the block base expects that you are going to have a build method defined in your block. Since my block is using this trait, I might as well have the trait name the method build because now it just has what it needs. There's no reason that the controller can't also use the same method as build. You can name your methods anything that you want. If you had a situation that you have a trait and you needed the method name to be something different, you can actually alias things so that whatever the method name is in the trait, you could name the method differently inside of your class that's using the trait. In fact, you can alias the name of the trait if you needed to for whatever, and Drupal actually does this. Drupal will alias the trait names, and Drupal will also alias some of the method names that the trait defines. So you are totally free to use whatever method names you want inside of your trait, because anything that uses that trait is going to be able to end up naming it however they want as well. In my situation, this was a perfectly good name, and I didn't alias the trait. I didn't alias the method name at all. It just gets used straight up. How does it get used, you might ask? Aha, good question. Let me show you the way. Ta-da! Inside of your class, you say use that trait. If you've been looking at the slides that I've had up here, you may have noticed all these use statements that were at the top. This use statement is different than the use statements that are at the top. The use statements that are outside of your class, that's helping you with your namespace, and so you don't have to fully qualify everything inside of your class. And in fact, if you look at this controller that I have written that uses this table of contents trait, you will see that there's actually a use statement at the top of there that says the proper namespace of where it even finds this table of contents trait. But that's all it takes to use a trait. You might need a use statement so PHP knows where it's going to load, what namespace it's going to load it from, but then you just say use trait inside of your class. And what this is basically the exact same thing as is like an include or an include once or a require once. Just like you do in procedural code, what ends up happening is when this class, this file is going to be parsed by PHP and compiled into an object, and it sees the use table of contents trait, it basically takes that logic from the trait, those lines of code, and it kind of like copies and pastes it right in there. You can use the trait wherever you want to use it inside the class. It doesn't have to be at the very top of it. You could have other things going on and you could put the use statement later on. But what ends up happening basically is that that code gets copied right into there and now gets compiled by the PHP interpreter, and now it's just part of your class. So that's traits and how you use traits. Let's move on to some of the other things that you may have noticed. I know I'm moving along really quickly here, and so you might not have totally processed, but subconsciously you might have looked at some of my doc blocks, and you might have seen some strange things in the doc blocks saying, gee, this doesn't look like a comment that's up there. That's kind of a weird looking comment that I saw. What was that thing that I saw there? And if you did happen to notice that funny comment is actually an annotation. And if you didn't happen to notice it, don't worry, because there's the slide image that I'm going to show you, and you're going to get a chance to see an annotation. Drupal has chosen to use annotations as a way that we can provide. It's used in plugins. Every plugin uses annotations in Drupal 8. And the annotation allows you to define things like what's the machine name of this, and allows you to actually define a lot of things about that class that you're writing. In addition, it can provide some functionality, and we're going to see an example of that as well. So those funny comments are actually more like code than they are comments. And this is something that has also had a little bit of controversy, even in the Drupal 8 community. Not everybody was in love with the idea of using annotations. They're like, wow, that's just kind of weird that you have code and comments. But that's the way it's been done. So it's important for you to know about it. So let's look at an example of an annotation. When you create a block is actually a type of a plugin. And so you use the block annotation. And so one of the things that you specify is this ID, which is basically giving your machine name for that block. If you're familiar with the ways things that were done in Drupal 7 and Drupal 6, you had to, we had the different types of the hooks that we had there, and your machine name was driven from like your module name, and all of your hooks needed to have that machine name prepended in front of the hook that you were using there. Well, the way that you can do things now in Drupal 8 is that you just assign your machine name in the ID, and that is required. That's one of the keys of the annotation that's required for you to use. It has to be unique. You have to have it across the whole application, the unique machine name. The administrative label in the category, that's what you see when you're in the block layout interface and the modal comes up. So that's for informational purposes. The really cool key that we have in this annotation is this context key. This is an example of where this actually adds some functionality to this class that I'm writing. I didn't have to extend any particular class. I didn't have to implement any particular interface. But by using this context annotation key, I've got a new function that's available to me here. And so we're going to be using the node context. And what this allows us to do, if you remember when you were creating views in Drupal 7, or even if you're creating views in Drupal 8 now, blocks can't receive arguments. And so what you typically do in a view is you go into the advanced field set, you open that up, you add a contextual filter, and then you say provide a default, and you say get content ID from URL, and now your block has some way that it knows how to reference the node. This context gives you the ability to know this is the node that's being displayed, and I can grab that node and get at all of the contents in that node. And the way you do it is by using this getContextValue method. We use that key in the annotation that now makes this method available to us, and you will notice that what we're saying is the context value that we're getting is node. I'm only aware of two contexts in Drupal 8 right now. There's the node context and there's the user context. And so in our annotation, we need to specify which one we're using, and then later on in our code, we can get at that through the getContextValue. Honestly, I still haven't figured out how Drupal even knows what these contexts means and how it does anything with it. I mean, I've grepped around, I've looked in different things, and I still don't get how it works, but I just know that you can do it, and I made use of it in this block here. So it's cool, and it's a little bit baffling at the same time. But this is a really good example of how powerful annotations can be, is the fact that you can use this context key in the annotation, and now you've got the ability to grab the node that's being displayed there. I think it's pretty cool anyway. All right. I've mentioned a lot about dependency injection now. I talked about we're type hinting with interfaces and you're injecting and it goes into the constructor and all this kind of stuff. Services, this, that, pluggable. If there's one thing that you're going to get out of this presentation, it's dependency injection. This is such a key concept in Drupal 8, is understanding dependency injection. And I'm saying there's three types of dependency injection, which isn't really true. There's only two, but if you really look at it, there's only one, but three sounds way cooler than two or one. So I'm breaking it into three types of dependency injection. I'm going to say there's dependency injection when you got a service that you're writing. There's dependency injection when you're using a container interface, which is like what you do when you've got a controller. The controller base already implements the container interface. So when you're writing a controller, it's already set up for dependency injection. And the third type is when you do a container factory plugin interface. When you write a block, you extend the block base, but the block base doesn't actually implement any of the dependency injection container interfaces, okay? So these are the three examples that we're going to see of dependency injection right here. So I've got a service that I've written, and it's my presentation manager service. My presentation manager service also actually needs the entity type manager. So the way I inject the entity type manager service into my service is in my services YAML file. And I tell Symfony, this is what this at is telling it. I've got a service that I want you to inject in my service. So this is how we do dependency injection with the service. And then what ends up happening is inside of my service, you see here's my constructor. And Symfony has passed that entity type manager into my constructor of my service. And now I can get at that entity type manager so that I can get at node storage. So that's the first example of dependency injection, is via services, and you do it in the services YAML file. And you've got that arguments that you pass to it. The second example of doing dependency injection is like if you're in a controller, for instance. And so what we've got, I needed to inject the presentation manager service into my controller so I could make use of its methods. And so what we've got is, here's my constructor here where it gets injected. Because I'm using the dependency injection container, and there's an interface that's associated with that, Symfony knows that I'm implementing that interface, and so it knows that I must have this method that's called create. And this create method is where I tell Symfony what I wanted to inject into my class when it instantiates my class with a new statement. And so this is where I'm telling Symfony, I want you to give me the presentation manager service. Symfony is going to do the new statement, and it's going to pass in the presentation manager service. Now, some of you may say, wait a minute, I thought you said the great thing about services is that this is pluggable, it's swappable, but you just hard-coded in here that you want the presentation manager service. You need to tell Symfony what you want someplace, right? I mean, Symfony isn't just going to pull it out of thin air. So we need to tell it somehow, but have no fear. There is a way that in your own application you could say, hey, when they say they want the presentation manager service, what I really want you to give it is this new service that I've written. So it isn't as hard-coded as it looks, okay? It is still swappable. It is still something that you can maintain this decoupled nature of things. And the third example that we're going to look at is like when we're using the Container Factory plugin interface. And so this is where I've got this block, which extends the block base. But the block base doesn't actually implement the necessary interface. So I have to explicitly say that I'm implementing the Container Factory plugin interface. the controller already tells that it's implemented interface. So this is the only difference between the block and the controller, is in the block we need to explicitly say that we're implementing an interface, and then it looks exactly the same as what we had with the controller. Is we've got our create method that's available to us. We care about the presentation manager service, but because of the fact that we're doing a block plugin, we actually, when we construct the block, we actually need to use, this is an example of where the construct method is calling the parents constructor as well, using that scope resolution operator. Because we're calling that, we need to be able to pass that certain things, and that's why our create method has these other 3 lines that we don't really care about in our block, but our parent does care about it. What we really wanted was the presentation manager service. And so that gets injected, and then we use it to put it into one of our properties, so we go to the presentation manager. So that's the 3 types of ways that you'll see dependency injection used in Drupal: through services, through the controller, and through the blocks. That's the 3 basic ways that you're always going to have things injected. So what you're really seeing with dependency injection, it might sound like a big scary word. All that's really happening is, like, if you think in terms of procedural code, when you've got a function that accepts arguments and you pass the arguments in, it's the same type of thing with object-oriented. You're just passing in an object that needs to be used inside of another class, another object. And the reason you do that is this gives you a way that you can have much better decoupling of your code, and especially when you want to be doing testing. Instead of having all this logic that's like rolled out inside, you just inject something that you get to use. And now when you're doing your tests, you're able to mock that object that's injected, and you only need to test your specific code. You can assume that all the code and the rest of the objects work. So it makes testing very much cleaner to do. Okay. I mentioned the routing YAML file. The routing file is what's taking place of one of the pieces of what we used to do in hook menu in Drupal. I've got a couple of controllers here. We need to know how we get to those controllers, what path they're accessed on. And so what I've got is my routing YAML file that says, all right, here's where the thing is that displays the table of contents. And here's where the thing is that when I'm going to actually have the controller that gives the content to put inside of these modals, that's the path name that you get to there. And then this is where I tell it the information about how do you know who's allowed to get to it, and what's the actual class that you use and the method that you use to get to it. That's what the routing YAML file does for you. It associates a path with some type of object that's going to be responsible for returning the contents when somebody goes to that path. Okay, getting close here. I mentioned I've got libraries. Why we've got libraries in Drupal 8 is that Drupal 8 has tried to make sure that performance is as good as possible, and instead of loading every single thing on every single page, we've got this idea of our asset libraries. And so you put things into your asset libraries, and then you say when you want that library to be attached. And when you don't attach the library, it doesn't add any of the additional stuff to the page. So you use your library's YAML file so that you can be more careful about what's getting loaded on a page. I needed a library's YAML file because I have this tiny bit of JavaScript that gave me the ability to click on my slides, and then it shows the next bullet point, and the next bullet point, and the next bullet point. So I created that library that holds that JavaScript file, and then I say when I want that to be attached. So the way I attached it was through a template, and that's what leads us into hooks. Not everything in Drupal is object-oriented. Some stuff still needs to use procedural. Namely, one of the things is hooks. And I needed to use a hook in my module because I needed to define a template, because I used a template to say to attach the library. So the hook that I ended up using in my module was this hook theme. And I said, when you're dealing with a theme, Drupal will pick up your template automatically. When you're dealing with a module, Drupal will not pick up that template automatically. You need to use hook theme to say, this is the template that I'm defining. So I defined this node slide full template. And the reason I defined the node slide full template, which happens to be a twig template, and by the way, twig is very similar to what we did with our TPL files. It's easier to use. We can still do the overriding. And we can actually, there's twig debugging that we can use to find out what the template suggestions are. But what I needed a template for, oh, and so this is where I'm showing. This is the template that I used, was this node slide full template. I needed that node slide full template so that when I'm looking at the full node view of the slide, I can have this thing that says attach library. That's why I needed a template This library only gets attached when I'm looking at the slide view. It doesn't get attached if you're looking at any other nodes on the site. And where you can specify if you want to turn Twig debugging on, this is the services YAML file. This is also where you'd be able to go into if you wanted to override some existing service, you wanted to have your own version of that service, that's where you get a chance to tell Drupal 8 and Symfony, like, oh, actually when you're saying to inject this service, inject mine instead. So you do that in this services YAML file. And here's an example of what I did with mine, is I said to turn Twig debugging on. And when you turn Twig debugging on, that gives you the ability to see something like this. When you view page source, it's showing you what the template suggestions are, and it's showing you what template is actually in use on the page. So this is something that's so much better for themers now too. When they're having to figure out, why is this page rendering this way? If they turn Twig debugging on, they're able to look at the code comments in the HTML, and they're going to say, ah, okay, I know exactly what template I need to go to. That's what's generating this page. All right, great. I told you I was going to have to talk really fast, and there's going to be a lot of information. I wrapped it up almost exactly on time. I was supposed to go to 4:25. I went to 4:26, even though I was handicapped by maybe almost 10 minutes before I got to start here. So I would actually be happy to answer questions. I know that it's the end of the day, and I know that you guys are probably ready to head out and go to whatever. But you know where to get in touch with me if you were paying attention at the beginning. You can get to me through GitHub. Please, you can file issues against the presentation module. You can file issues against this presentation that I've written. I really do want your feedback. I want this stuff to be useful as it can be. I want people to be able to get stuff out of it. Thank you for attending. I know I've thrown a lot at you, but I do hope that this has given you a chance to see some of the really cool stuff that you can do in Drupal 8, and I've made it a little less scary for you about what some of this stuff is and how you would go about using it. Ta-da! You survived, and so did I. Thank you.